My name is Hilda. For 60 years, I built a life I believed was unshakable, a fortress of love and memory that I thought would be my legacy. What I am about to share with you will tear down the very idea of what you think a family is, what you trust a parent's love to be, and what you believe lies behind the eyes of the child you raised. Just 3 days ago, my own son, my flesh and blood, and his wife, the woman I welcomed as a daughter, pushed my husband Henry and me off a 90-foot cliff. Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. As I lay there shattered on those cold, unforgiving rocks, my body screaming in a language of pure agony, I felt the warm trickle of my own blood tracing a path down my temple. And in that chaos of pain and terror, I heard my husband's voice, a desperate, broken whisper that cut through the haze. "Hilda, don't move. Play dead." But that moment of horror, as unimaginable as it was, wasn't the worst of it. The true abyss opened later, when Henry, with his own dying breath, it seemed, revealed a truth so monstrous, so soul-crushing, that it made the physical pain feel like a mercy. It was a secret our children had guarded for 25 years, a poison they had let seep into the very roots of our family tree. But to understand the depth of the fall, you must first see the height from which we fell. You have to picture the life we had, the perfect picture we painted over 40 long and beautiful years. We lived in a little suburban home, the kind that seems to exist now only in memory or in old movies. It was a place where the smell of fresh coffee from our percolator would dance in the morning air, mingling with the sound of the birds singing their daily chorus from the old oak tree in the yard. That was my signal to start the day, that simple, beautiful symphony. I was a teacher at the local elementary school, a profession that wasn't just a job but a calling. Every afternoon, I'd come home with my mind full of the small, significant triumphs of my young students, little Jimmy finally reading a full sentence aloud, little Sarah sharing her toy without being asked. I carried their joys home with me, and they became part of the fabric of our family's evenings. And Henry, my Henry, he had a carpentry shop in our backyard, a sanctuary of sawdust and dreams. His hands, rough and calloused from a lifetime of honest work, possessed a surprising delicacy. He could take a simple, unassuming piece of wood and see the soul trapped within it. Under his careful guidance, that wood would transform. It would bend and shape itself into the most beautiful furniture you've ever seen. A rocking chair that seemed to sing a lullaby with every creak. A dining table so solid and full of warmth it felt like the heart of our home. He didn't just build furniture, he created heirlooms, pieces that held stories in their grain. Our family was completed by our 2 sons. Richard, our firstborn, was the sun around which our world orbited. He was the soul of our house, a boy whose laughter was a physical force, capable of lifting the weight of any bad day. He was always helping his father in the shop, his own small hands eagerly trying to mimic Henry's steady movements. And he was my protector, even from things that didn't need protecting. If I looked even slightly worried, he was there with a hug, a joke, a promise that everything was okay. He had a light inside him that you could feel, a genuine goodness that made you believe in better things. Then there was Damien, 5 years younger. He was different, from the start, quieter, more reserved, a child who lived in the quieter corners of the house. He didn't command a room like Richard, he observed it. As a mother, you tell yourself you never play favorites, that your love is a vast, unending ocean, and each child has their own shore. And I truly believed that. I loved Damien with the same fierce, all-consuming intensity that I loved Richard. But where Richard's love was a warm, open fire, Damien's was a contained one, and you had to sit closer to feel its heat. Sundays were sacred. After church, the whole family would gather around our massive oak dining table, the one Henry had carved with his own hands, a masterpiece that had witnessed every important moment of our lives together. The grooves and scratches on its surface weren't flaws, they were a map of our history. Richard would be bursting with plans, telling us about his dreams to study engineering, to build bridges and skyscrapers. His future was a bright, sprawling city full of possibility. Damien, meanwhile, would remain quiet, pushing the food around on his plate with his fork, lost in a world of his own. I'd try to draw him out, ask about school, about his friends, and he'd offer one-word answers, a quiet smile that never quite reached his eyes. I told myself he was just shy, a deep thinker. Life was simple. It was beautiful in its uncomplicated rhythm. In the evenings, after the dishes were done, Henry and I would take our walks. We'd follow the trail that wound around our small town, holding hands like teenagers. We'd talk about everything and nothing, our dreams of traveling when we retired, of finally seeing the ocean for the first time, of maybe one day building a smaller, more manageable house once the boys were grown and had families of their own. I remember the scent of honeysuckle on those evening walks, the way the fireflies would appear as if on cue, little dots of magic against the deepening purple of the sky. I never, not once, imagined that those peaceful walks were a grim training ground for the one that would almost end our lives. On weekends, our home would burst at the seams with life. I'd host family gatherings, and my sisters Harriet and Irene would descend with their husbands and children. The house would become a symphony of chaos and joy, children running through the halls, their footsteps a thunder of pure energy, the women gathered in the kitchen, sharing recipes and secrets over simmering pots, the men outside, supposedly fixing something in the yard, but really just enjoying each other's company, and the simple pleasure of a cool drink on a warm afternoon. And through it all, there was Henry, my rock, my perfect partner. After 40 years of marriage, he still had the heart of that young man who had courted me. He'd bring me wildflowers, little bursts of color he'd picked on his way home from work. In the evenings, he'd sit with me at this very table and help me grade my students' tests, his large, wood-stained fingers carefully circling misspelled words. And in his workshop, I'd hold pieces of wood steady for him while he cut, the saws whine a familiar song between us. We were a team, an unbreakable unit. Or so I believed, with every fiber of my being. At night, we'd sit together on the porch, two old souls in matching rocking chairs, watching the stars pepper the vast, dark canvas of the sky. We'd plan our future in hushed, hopeful tones. We talked about growing old right here, in this house, surrounded by the ghosts of our happiest memories and the living, breathing joy of our grandchildren. We imagined a life that was a gentle, slow sunset, full of warmth and peace. But perfect happiness, as I would learn in the most brutal way possible, is often just a beautiful mask. It's the brilliant, dazzling surface of a lake that hides the monstrous, cold depths beneath. You float along on its placid surface, blissfully unaware of the currents pulling you slowly, inexorably, toward the waterfall. And by the time you hear the roar, it's already too late. The current has you, and the fall is inevitable. The first real crack in our perfect picture, the one I couldn't just explain away or ignore, began to form when Richard turned 20. It was a subtle shift at first, a change in the atmosphere of our home. He and Damien began to argue, not the simple brotherly squabbles over the television remote or the last piece of pie, but heated, whispered arguments about things I didn't understand. I'd catch the tail end of a tense conversation in the hallway, and the moment I appeared, a curtain of silence would fall. They'd look at me with tight smiles, their eyes avoiding each other. "It's nothing, Mom," Richard would say, his voice too light. "Just brother stuff." Damien would just shrug and disappear into his room. I went to Henry, my worry a knot in my stomach. "Something's wrong between them," I'd tell him. "It feels different." He'd pull me into a hug, his familiar scent of sawdust and soap a comfort. "Hilda, they're young men now," he'd say, his voice calm and steady. "They have their own lives, their own disagreements. It'll pass." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. Because the alternative, that the perfect family I had built was showing fissures in its foundation, was too terrifying to entertain. So, I did what I had always done. I poured more love into the cracks, hoping it would be enough to seal them. I made their favorite meals, I tried to plan more family activities, I pretended not to notice the tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. But the storm did break. It broke on a cold, clear night in October, exactly 25 years ago. A night that would become the dividing line in my life, the before and the after. Richard didn't come home for dinner. That in itself was unusual. He was reliable, my Richard. He'd call if he was going to be late. We waited as the clock on the mantel ticked past 7, then 8, then 9. The pot roast I'd made, his favorite, grew cold and congealed on its plate. By 11, my worry had curdled into a cold, sharp fear. By midnight, it was a full-blown panic. Henry tried calling his friends. No one had seen him. Damien was in his room, supposedly studying for an exam. But when I went to ask him if he knew where his brother might be, I saw something strange in his eyes. It wasn't just the absence of concern. It was a flat, almost guarded look, a shuttered expression that gave nothing away. "I don't know, Mom," he said, not meeting my gaze. He didn't tell me anything. Something about the way he said it, the practiced casualness of it, made my skin prickle. But I was too consumed with fear for Richard to give it much thought. Henry rallied our neighbors. They formed search parties, their flashlight beams cutting through the inky blackness of the night. They checked every corner of our small town, every trail Henry and I had walked so happily, every quiet spot Richard used to go to think. I stayed home by the phone, my hand permanently glued to the receiver, praying for it to ring with his cheerful voice on the other end. The phone did ring, as the first gray light of dawn began to stain the sky. It wasn't Richard. It was Henry, and his voice was a hollow, broken thing I didn't recognize. "Hilda," he said, and that one word contained a universe of pain. They found him. At the bottom of the river gorge. The world didn't just stop, it shattered. It exploded into a million sharp, glittering pieces that would never ever fit back together the same way again. The police said it was an accident. They said he must have stumbled in the dark, lost his footing on the loose rocks near the edge. It was a tragic, terrible accident, a parent's worst nightmare. And I, in my profound, desperate need for my world to still make some kind of sense, I clung to that explanation. I accepted it without question. Because the truth, the real, horrifying truth, was a monster I couldn't even allow myself to imagine. To question the accident would be to admit that the world was not just randomly cruel, but actively malicious. It was a truth so much more horrible that my mind refused to even glance in its direction. Richard's funeral was the darkest day of my life. I wore my only black dress, the same one I'd worn to bury my own mother. The church was packed, a sea of somber faces and muffled sobs. But amidst the overwhelming grief, one thing stood out to me, a single discordant note in the symphony of sorrow. Damien. He was calm, strangely, unnervingly composed. While I cried until I had no tears left, until I was just a dry, hollow shell of a woman, he remained quiet, his face an unreadable mask. He held my hand, he accepted condolences, but there was a stillness to him that, now, knowing what I know, sends violent shivers down my spine. It wasn't the stillness of shock, it was the stillness of calculation. Henry never left my side that entire day. He held me up when my legs refused to support me, he whispered words of comfort into my ear. But now, I understand the bitter taste those words must have had in his mouth. I know the secret weight he was carrying, a burden he would shoulder alone for 25 long years. In the weeks and months that followed, a new Damien emerged from the wreckage of our family. The quiet, reserved boy was gone, replaced by an attentive, loving young man. It was as if a switch had been flipped. He helped me with the chores without being asked. He spent hours in the workshop with Henry, trying to fill the deafening silence Richard had left behind. When he saw me lost in a memory, tears streaming down my face. He'd bring me a cup of tea, sit with me, and tell me it would be okay. I misinterpreted it all. I saw his behavior as his way of dealing with his own grief, his attempt to fill the unimaginable void his brother had left. I thought, in my profound and foolish naivete, that tragedy had forged him into a better man. How wrong I was. What I was witnessing wasn't a transformation. It was a performance. He wasn't building a new self. He was building a perfect mask, a masterwork of deception to hide the monster that lived underneath. And I, his loving, grieving mother, was his most willing and credulous audience. Henry's words hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating like smoke. I followed him. In that simple, devastating admission, the entire foundation of my world crumbled. The kitchen, once the warm, beating heart of our home, now felt like a cold, sterile interrogation room. The familiar scent of coffee and baking had vanished, replaced by the acrid taste of impending doom. My legs felt weak, boneless. I gripped the edge of the countertop, my knuckles turning white, to keep from sinking to the floor. You followed him." I managed to whisper, the words scraping against my dry throat. "Why, Henry, why would you do that?" He wouldn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on his hands, those strong, capable hands that had built our life, now resting helplessly on the table as if they belonged to a stranger. They were trembling. "Because I was worried," he said, his voice a hollow echo. Damien had been different those last few weeks. More aggressive. Sullen. I'd hear him muttering to himself. There was a resentment in him. Hilda, a bitterness that seemed to be festering. When I saw him slip out that night, with that look on his face, I don't know, a father's instinct, maybe. A bad feeling I couldn't shake. He finally lifted his eyes to meet mine, and what I saw in them shattered me anew. It was a bottomless well of guilt and a pain so profound it seemed to have aged him 20 years in an instant. "I followed him to the river gorge," he continued, the name of that cursed place a death knell in our quiet kitchen. "I heard them before I saw them. Their voices, Hilda, they weren't just arguing. They were screaming. Horrible, hateful things." My mind recoiled, refusing to paint the picture his words were creating. My boys, my 2 sons. Richard, with his light, and Damien, with his quiet intensity, screaming at each other in the dark. It was an image that didn't fit, a discordant note, in the symphony of my memories. "What?" I choked out, my voice breaking. What were they screaming about? Henry's shoulders slumped, the weight of his secret finally bowing him completely. "About the inheritance, Hilda." The word landed like a physical blow. Inheritance? They were so young. We were so young. It was a conversation for a distant, abstract future. Damien was furious, Henry went on, each word seeming to cost him a piece of his soul. He was obsessed with the idea that because Richard was the oldest, he would inherit most of everything. The house, the land, the savings. He called it an outdated, unfair tradition. He said Richard had always been the favorite, that he'd had everything handed to him. This was madness. We had never, ever spoken of such things. We had loved them equally, provided for them equally. The idea that Damien had been nursing this poisonous jealousy for years was incomprehensible to me. "But there was something more," Henry said, his voice dropping even lower, as if afraid the walls themselves might hear. "Something about money that Richard had found." A cold dread, colder than anything I had felt before, began to spread through my veins. "What money?" Henry let out a long, shuddering sigh, the sound of a man confessing a mortal sin. 3 days before he died, Richard came to talk to me in the workshop. He discovered that Damien had been stealing money from our family savings account. Small amounts at first, things we might not notice, $50, $100, but then, larger sums. 500, 1,000. Richard had proof. Bank statements, transfers. He'd been quietly investigating for months. The room began to spin. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I felt a violent wave of nausea rise in my throat. My youngest son, the one who had been so attentive, so caring after the tragedy, the one who had held my hand and brought me tea. A thief. He had been stealing from us even before his brother's death. The caring son was a phantom, the thief was the reality. Why didn't you ever tell me? The accusation tore from me, sharp and broken. The betrayal felt twofold, first Damien's, and now Henry's. For 25 years, he had let me live in ignorance, let me mourn with a clean, simple grief, while he carried this filthy, complicated truth alone. Because when I got to the gorge that night, he replied, his voice choked with tears he had never shed, it was already too late. He described the scene then, and I saw it unfold behind my eyes as if I had been there, a ghost witnessing my own family's destruction. I saw them standing near the edge. Richard had the papers in his hand, shaking them in Damien's face. He was yelling, "You're a thief! You're stealing from our own parents!" Damien was denying it, calling him crazy, a liar. But Richard, he was so angry, so righteous. He told Damien that if he didn't return every penny and confess to us, he would tell us everything himself. I could see it. I could see Richard's face, flushed with anger and betrayal. I could see Damien's, twisted with a fury I had never witnessed. And then Damien. He just snapped, "Hilda." Henry's voice was a raw whisper. He screamed that Richard had always looked down on him, that it was time for things to change. And then he pushed him. A silent scream built in my chest. He pushed him. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a stumble in the dark. It was murder, a deliberate, violent act of fratricide. I saw Richard's arms flailing. Henry sobbed, the memory finally overwhelming him. I saw the shock on his face. He tried to grab onto something, anything, but it was too late. He fell. Tears streamed down my face uncontrollably, hot and salty, mingling with the taste of blood from where I had bitten my lip. The image was unbearable. My beautiful Richard, so full of life, being extinguished by his own brother's hands. I ran to the edge, Henry continued, struggling to compose himself. And there was Damien, standing there, looking down. He was trembling, crying. When he saw me, he just kept repeating, "It was an accident, Dad. It was an accident." He tripped. He was trying to hit me, and I just defended myself, and he lost his balance. He looked at me with those desperate, terrified eyes. My son's eyes, and he begged me, "Dad, please. Help me." "And you believed him?" I murmured, though I already knew the answer. I knew it from the decades of silence, from the shadow that had lived in Henry's eyes ever since. He nodded slowly, a gesture of profound shame. He was my son, Hilda. My youngest son was begging for his life, and Richard was already gone. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't bring one back to life by destroying the other. I truly believed, that it was an accident in that moment, a moment of blind rage that went too far. I thought Damien had learned his lesson, that the horror of what happened would scare him straight, that he would become a better man because of it. The justification was flimsy, a life raft made of paper in a stormy sea of truth. But I could see the tortured logic he had clung to for a quarter of a century. "And the stolen money?" I asked, my voice hollow. "What about that?" "Damien promised he would pay it back," Henry said, a bitter, broken laugh escaping him. "Little by little. He swore he had taken the money to invest in a business deal that had gone wrong, that he was too ashamed to tell us. He swore on Richard's memory that he would never do anything like that again. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for an understanding I couldn't yet give. And I believed him, Hilda. God forgive me, I believed him because I needed to believe my son wasn't a killer." I pushed myself away from the counter, stumbling, my body moving on autopilot while my mind was a whirlwind of shattered glass. Everything I had believed about my family, about my surviving son, about the last 25 years of my life, was a grotesque lie. The caring son was a murderer. The grieving father was an accomplice. And I was the fool who had lived in the beautiful, curated museum of their deception. Did he ever pay the money back? I asked, though the look on Henry's face told me everything. Never, he replied, the word final and damning. In fact, he kept stealing. Smaller amounts, more spread out. $20 here, $50 there. Amounts I could pretend not to notice, because confronting him would have meant admitting that I had covered up a murder. Every time I stayed silent, every time I watched our bank account dwindle and said nothing, I became more of his accomplice. The horrible reality solidified, cold and hard in my gut. That's why he's so interested in controlling our finances now, I murmured, the pieces clicking into a terrifying mosaic. It's not because he cares about us. It's because he wants to finish what he started 25 years ago. He wants unfettered access. He wants to erase the evidence of his theft, both past and present. Henry nodded gravely. And there's something else, Hilda. Something I just discovered a few weeks ago. What else could there possibly be? What further depth of betrayal was left to plumb? I felt my heart constrict, certain it couldn't withstand another revelation. Henry went to his desk in the corner of the living room and pulled out a small folder of papers he had hidden beneath a stack of old utility bills. His movements were furtive, filled with a shame I now understood. I've been discreetly looking into Damien's finances, he confessed, spreading the papers on the table. They were printouts of bank statements, loan documents, things I couldn't fully comprehend. His carpentry business, it isn't doing as well as he wants us to believe. In fact, it's on the verge of collapse. He pointed to a number on a page, a figure that made my breath catch. He owes more than $100,000 to several banks and suppliers. He's drowning, Hilda. The papers trembled in my hands as I tried to focus on the numbers. Damien wasn't the successful, self-made man he pretended to be. He was a desperate failure, a man who had been living a lie, financing it first with stolen money and now with a murderous plan. Does Melissa know all this? I asked, my mind flashing to her sweet smile, her loving hugs, her constant presence. I'm sure she does, Henry replied, his voice grim. Haven't you noticed how she directs the conversations when they talk about our money? The specific questions about our savings, the exact value of the house, the details of our life insurance policies. Those aren't innocent questions, Hilda. They're the questions of someone calculating, down to the last penny, exactly how much our deaths are worth. That sentence, more than any other, chilled me to the marrow of my bones. Our deaths. I had been thinking in terms of robbery, of being cheated, but Henry had just given voice to the unthinkable. Our death, I repeated in a horrified whisper. It was the first time I had truly, fully considered that Damien might want us gone. Physically gone. If he had killed his own brother for money and secrecy, what would stop him from killing his parents for the same reason, especially when his own survival was now on the line? A new, more primal fear took hold of me. Henry, I said, grabbing his hands, needing to feel his solid, real presence. We have to go to the police. We have to tell them the truth about Richard and about what's happening now. But my husband shook his head, a look of hopeless despair on his face that broke my heart all over again. With what evidence, Hilda? He asked, his voice cracking. I'm an acceiver, accomplice to covering up a murder. If I talk now, I'll go to jail, too. And besides, who's going to believe a 65-year-old man who's been hiding this secret for 25 years? They'll say I'm confused, that I'm senile, that I'm trying to blame my surviving son for a tragic accident because I can't handle my grief. The terrible logic of it was inescapable. He was right. We were trapped in a nightmare of our own making, a nightmare Henry had entered to save his son, and I had entered out of blissful ignorance. So what do we do? I asked, my voice rising in panic. Just wait for him to kill us like he killed Richard? We're going to be very careful, Henry said, trying to sound more confident than he was. He squeezed my hands. We're going to find a way to protect ourselves. We'll gather evidence. His words were cut off by the shrill, sudden ring of the telephone. We both froze. The sound was an intrusion, a violation of our sacred, horrifying space. We stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. It rang again, insistent. Slowly, mechanically, I walked over and picked up the receiver. Hello? Hi, Mom. It was Damien. His voice was bright, cheerful, the picture of a loving son. That familiar, sweet tone that now sounded as sinister as a serpent's hiss. Melissa and I were just thinking, and we believe it would be so beautiful to celebrate your 40th wedding anniversary with something special. My blood turned to ice. I looked at Henry, who had gone pale, his eyes wide with the same terror that was clawing at my own throat. How about we take you to those mountains you've always talked about? Damien continued, his voice dripping with false enthusiasm. Next weekend? We could go on a family hike, take some pictures, have a perfect day together. It was an invitation to our own execution. I could feel it in the very core of my being. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. That's a very sweet idea, son. I managed to stammer out, my voice trembling so much I was sure he could hear it. But let us think about it. We'll get back to you tomorrow. Of course, Mom. No pressure. Just want to make it special for you, and Dad, love you. Love you too, I whispered, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. I hung up the phone and leaned against the wall, my legs finally giving way. Henry was at my side in an instant, holding me up. The mountains, I murmured, the word itself a death sentence. He's going to take us to the mountains to kill us, to make it look like an accident. Henry nodded gravely, his face a mask of grim resignation. Just like Richard at the gorge. That night, we didn't sleep a single minute. We lay in our bed, holding each other in the dark, not as lovers but as fellow prisoners on death row. We whispered plans, desperate, half-formed strategies for how we could possibly save ourselves from the child we had raised, from the monster we had unknowingly nurtured in our home. The perfect picture was gone, replaced by the grim certainty of the cliff's edge, waiting for us in the mountains. The days that followed Henry's confession were a waking nightmare, painted in shades of gray and a constant, humming fear. The world outside our windows, the singing birds, the rustling leaves, the distant laughter of children felt like a mockery, a play continuing on a stage we had been forcibly ejected from. We were ghosts in our own home, moving through the familiar motions of life while our minds were trapped in a prison of dread. Every creak of the floorboards, every ring of the phone, every car that slowed near our house sent a jolt of pure terror through me. We were waiting for the axe to fall, waiting for our son to make his move. And in the center of this storm of fear was the agonizing reevaluation of the last 25 years. My mind became a torturous cinema, replaying every memory, every interaction with Damien, but now through the cracked lens of the truth. The new Damien, who had emerged after Richard's death, wasn't new at all. He was a carefully constructed performance, and I had been his most devoted audience. I remembered the first time he brought me a cup of tea after the funeral. I had been weeping in Richard's old room, clutching one of his old sweaters to my face, trying to find his scent. Damien had entered quietly, placed the steaming mug on the bedside table, and sat beside me. He didn't speak. He just put his arm around me. At the time, I had felt a surge of maternal warmth so powerful it almost eclipsed my grief. He's trying to be strong for me, I had thought. He's trying to fill the void. Now, I saw the scene with horrifying clarity. It wasn't comfort he was offering, it was a down payment. A calculated gesture to secure my trust, to cement his role as the devoted surviving son. Every chore he took over, every afternoon he spent in the workshop with Henry, every time he shielded me from a bill or a household worry, it wasn't love. It was consolidation. He was systematically removing any reason for us to doubt him, to question him, to look too closely at him. He was building his alibi for a crime he had already committed and preparing the groundwork for the ones he had yet to. His marriage to Melissa, which I had seen as his salvation, now took on a sinister new light. Had she known from the beginning? Was she a fellow architect of this deception? I thought of their wedding day, of how she had looked at him with such adoration. Was that, too, a performance? Or was she another one of his victims, seduced by the facade of the successful, sensitive carpenter, only to be slowly entangled in his web of lies and debt? The perfect family life they presented to us, the happy visits, the well-behaved grandchildren. The stories of business success was nothing more than a beautiful veneer covering rot. Their entire existence was a stage play, and we were not just the audience, we were the props, soon to be disposed of when the final act required it. The pressure to sell the house, which I had found so hurtful, now revealed its true, brutal logic. This house was our fortress, the physical manifestation of our life together. It was filled with neighbors who knew us, with memories that anchored us. In a small town, people notice things. If two elderly people suddenly vanished from a house they loved, questions might be asked. But if they wisely downsized to an anonymous apartment in town? An apartment with no history, no roots, where an accident would raise fewer eyebrows? It was the perfect way to isolate us, to cut us off from our support system, to make us more vulnerable. And the power of attorney, that was the masterstroke. With control over our finances, he wouldn't have to wait for us to die. He could bleed us dry while we were still alive, funneling our life savings into his failing business and his debts to those dangerous people Henry had discovered. Our slow, helpless impoverishment would be just another tragic story of elderly financial abuse. And if we protested? If we threatened to go to the police? Then the accident would simply happen sooner. The power of attorney was the key that would unlock everything, and we had almost handed it to him. This was the new Damien. Not a son redeemed by tragedy, but a criminal refined by it. The impulsive, jealous young man who had pushed his brother in a fit of rage had been replaced by a cold, patient, and methodical predator. He had spent 25 years honing his craft, and we were his final masterpiece. 3 days after the phone call about the mountain trip, they came to visit. We had to act. We had to pretend that the world hadn't been ripped out from under us. It was the most difficult performance of our lives. When their car pulled into the driveway, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Henry squeezed my hand, his own palm damp with sweat. "Remember," he whispered, his voice tight. "We know nothing, we are happy. We are trusting." The door opened and Melissa swept in, a shopping bag in one hand and that radiant false smile plastered on her face. "Hilda, dear," she chirped, enveloping me in a hug. Her arms felt like constricting vines. I forced my body to remain pliant, to not stiffen in revulsion. I even managed to pat her back, a grotesque pantomime of affection. "I brought some supplies for our mountain adventure," she announced, pulling away and holding up the bag as if it were a trophy. "Cookies, bottled water, fresh fruit, everything we'll need for a lovely picnic." I looked at the innocent items in the bag and saw tools for a murder scene. The water to wash down the dust of the trail, the food to maintain the illusion of a happy outing, the picnic itself a macabre final meal. "I also brought my new camera," she added, her eyes gleaming with a excitement that turned my stomach. She pulled out a sleek, expensive-looking digital camera. "I want to capture every moment of this special day. They're going to be photos we'll treasure forever." The irony was so thick, I could taste it, metallic and foul, in my mouth. The only photos she would treasure would be the ones that documented the accident site for the authorities, proving what a wonderful, loving family outing it had been until tragedy struck. Damien came in behind her, carrying a brand new hiking backpack. It looked professional, laden with gear. "Dad," he said, clapping Henry on the shoulder with a familiarity that felt like a violation. I went out and got all the necessary equipment for a safe hike. Ropes, climbing harnesses, powerful lanterns, a comprehensive first aid kit. Every word was a lie wrapped in concern, safety equipment to plan our murders. The ropes weren't for safety, they were for the rescuers to use later. The first aid kit was a prop. The perverse genius of it was enough to make me dizzy. He had thought of everything. Isn't it a bit dangerous for people our age? I asked, trying to sound like a gently worried mother, not a terrified woman facing her own mortality. I was searching for any crack, any excuse to call this off. Melissa immediately glided over and stroked my cheek. Her touch was ice cold. That's exactly why we chose a very easy, very safe trail, she cooed, her voice dripping with false reassurance. It's a path even young children can manage. And Damien and I will be right there with you the entire time to take care of you. Yes, I thought, a hysterical laugh bubbling in my chest. You'll be right there, right behind us. Until the moment you shove us into the abyss. That night, after they finally left, the act collapsed. Henry and I sank onto our living room sofa, trembling not from the evening chill, but from the sheer effort of containing our terror for hours. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the ragged sound of our breathing. We can't go, I said, my voice raw. I grabbed Henry's hands, holding them tightly, as if he were the only solid thing in a world turning to quicksand. We just can't. We'll make up an excuse. I'm sick. You've thrown your back out. Anything. Henry looked at me, his eyes pools of exhaustion and grim acceptance. And if we don't go? He asked softly. They'll just find another way, Hilda. Something that looks even more accidental. A gas leak in the house. A fire that starts while we're asleep. A robbery that turns violent. At least in the mountains. We know what they're going to try to do. We have the advantage of foreknowledge. His words were logical, but they offered no comfort. They only painted a future where every potential accident was a potential murder. So what do we do? I asked, desperation clawing at me. Walk willingly to our deaths? Henry was quiet for a long time, his brow furrowed in concentration. I could see the gears turning, the father and craftsman trying to build a solution out of impossible materials. We go, he said finally, his voice gaining a sliver of steel, but we go prepared. I'm going to hide my cell phone. I'll set it to record audio from the moment we leave the house. If we survive, we'll have evidence of their conversations, their plans. And if we don't? His voice broke, but he pressed on. If we don't, at least the recording might be found. Someone will know the truth. It was a desperate, flimsy plan. But it was a plan. It was a thread of hope. The next day, Henry went to his desk. He pulled out a sealed envelope from a hidden compartment. I wrote a letter, he confessed, his voice low. It's addressed to your sister Harriet. In it, I've written down everything. Everything about Richard's death, what Damien has been doing, and what we believe they're planning to do to us on this trip. He held it out to me. The paper felt heavy, imbued with the weight of our fate. I've hidden it in our lockbox, with our wills and the deed to the house. If we don't return, Harriet will know where to look. She'll know it wasn't an accident. I took the envelope, my hands shaking. This was it. We were preparing for our own deaths. We were writing the final chapter of our story, because we feared our son was about to write it for us in blood. The night before the trip, we didn't even pretend to eat dinner. We sat at our beautiful oak table, the site of so much joy, and pushed food around our plates. The food tasted like dust. Every bite was a struggle. Afterwards, Henry meticulously reviewed our will one more time, making small, precise annotations, ensuring that if the worst happened, there would be legal hurdles, questions, a paper trail that would lead back to our suspicions. That night, we went to bed and held each other. Not with passion, but with the desperate clutch of two people about to be swept away by a flood. We whispered in the dark words that were meant to be comforting, but were filled with a heartbreaking finality. "If something happens to me," Henry whispered, his lips close to my ear, "I want you to know that these 40 years with you have been the best of my life. Despite everything, despite my mistakes and my secrets, I have loved you more than my own life." Tears streamed from my eyes, soaking into my pillow. I didn't try to stop them. I memorized the rhythm of his breathing, the solid warmth of his body beside mine, the faint scent of sawdust that still clung to his skin. I tried to brand these sensations into my soul, to take them with me wherever I was going. Sleep was impossible. We lay there, wrapped in each other and in our terror, waiting for the dawn. Waiting for our son to come and take us on our final journey. The new Damien had completed his transformation. He was no longer our son. He was our executioner, and the sun was about to rise on the day of our death. Saturday morning dawned with a sky of such impossible, cruel clarity it felt like a personal insult. The sun rose in a blaze of gold and pink, painting the world in vibrant, cheerful colors that stood in stark contrast to the funeral shroud wrapped around my heart. It was the kind of beautiful day we would have once celebrated with a long walk, a picnic in the yard, with laughter echoing off the trees. Now, it was the backdrop for our demise. I moved through the quiet house like a specter, my body operating on a strange, numb autopilot. I made coffee, the rich aroma that had once been a comfort now smelling like ash. I set out 2 mugs, my movements slow and deliberate, as if I were performing a sacred, final ritual. Every action felt weighted, momentous. Washing the few dishes in the sink, I found myself memorizing the feel of the warm water on my skin, the view of the bird feeder from the window, the way the morning light fell in a specific rectangle on the kitchen floor. I was collecting these sensory details, these last fragments of my ordinary life, to take with me into the void. Henry was already dressed, sitting at the table with his hands folded in front of him. He looked older than I had ever seen him, the lines on his face carved deeper by fear and a sleepless night. He had already discreetly positioned his cell phone in the inner pocket of his jacket, the recording function set and ready. It was a tiny, digital witness, our only ally in the horror to come. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway was a gunshot in the quiet morning. My body went rigid, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. Henry met my eyes across the room, and in that single look, we exchanged a lifetime of love and a silent, desperate goodbye. The front door swung open without a knock. "Morning, lovebirds." Damien's voice rang out, cheerful and bright, a monstrous parody of a happy sun. He stood there, silhouetted in the doorway, whistling a jaunty tune that grated on my nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Ready for your big adventure?" He was dressed in expensive new hiking gear, from his moisture-wicking shirt to his rugged boots. He looked every inch the experienced, caring outdoorsman. Behind him, Melissa appeared, radiant and fresh as if she were heading to a spa day, not to the site of a double murder. Her smile was wide and unwavering. "Good morning, Hilda." "Henry," she chirped, sweeping in and air-kissing my cheek. Her perfume, usually a light floral scent, was cloying and suffocating. "Isn't it a perfect day for this? The weather is just divine." We were ushered to the breakfast table, where we sat and pretended to eat the toast and eggs I had prepared. Every bite was like chewing on sawdust. I had to consciously force myself to swallow, my throat constricting with fear. Damien, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of false enthusiasm. He spread a detailed topographic map across the table, his finger tracing a route in red marker. "Okay, so here's the plan," he explained, his voice full of a tour guide's practiced charm. "We'll start at the trailhead here. It's a beautiful, well-maintained path that winds through some ancient forest. Then, we'll gradually ascend to this lookout point here." His finger landed on a spot marked Eagle's Perch. "They say the views from up there are absolutely spectacular. You can see the entire valley, the river snaking through it. It's truly breathtaking." His eyes shone with an eagerness that was demonic. Of course, the views would be spectacular, I thought, a hysterical sob trapped in my chest. They would be the last thing we would ever see. "The trail has a few steeper sections," Melissa added, pouring more orange juice into our glasses as if this were a lovely brunch. "But nothing that two experienced walkers like you can't handle." "You're always talking about your evening walks." Her comment about our experience was a cruel inside joke. Our evening walks were gentle strolls on flat, paved paths around our neighborhood. This was a mountain hike. They were setting the stage, preemptively framing our deaths as the tragic overestimation of two proud, aging parents. As we finished the charade of breakfast and began to load their SUV, I watched Damien with a hunter's focus. He was meticulously checking the contents of his backpack, his movements efficient and practiced. I saw the coils of rope, the shiny metal carabiners, a small, foldable shovel, and then my blood ran cold as I spotted it, a sleek, black object that looked unmistakably like a flare gun. "What's that for?" I asked, pointing, trying to keep my voice light, curious. Damien didn't even flinch. He picked it up smoothly. "For safety, Mom," he said, his tone matter of fact. "Standard procedure, if we get lost or separated, or if something goes wrong, we can send up a distress signal. It's just a precaution." Of course, I thought, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying precision. They would send up the flare after we were dead. It would ensure our bodies were found quickly, confirming the tragic accident narrative. The rescue would happen promptly for them, the traumatized survivors. Every single detail was calculated. Every piece of equipment had a dual, sinister purpose. The perfection of their planning was its own special kind of terror. The 2-hour car ride to the mountains was an exercise in surreal torture. Melissa put on a playlist of cheerful, upbeat folk music and sang along softly, her voice sweet and melodic. She pointed out scenic vistas as we drove, exclaiming over beautiful barns and rolling hills. Damien drove with an almost obsessive caution, perfectly obeying the speed limit, using his turn signal well in advance, coming to a complete stop at every empty intersection. He was the picture of a responsible, careful driver. He didn't want to risk a fender bender, a speeding ticket, anything that could derail his perfect, murderous itinerary. In the back seat, Henry and I sat in silence, our hands discreetly linked between us. I felt the subtle movement as he confirmed the phone in his pocket was still recording. The soft red light of the recording indicator was a tiny, brave heartbeat in the darkness of his jacket. Every false note of Melissa's singing, every logical explanation from Damien, every one of our terrified silences was being captured. This tiny device was our sword and our shield. It was the only thing standing between us and oblivion. When we finally arrived at the trailhead, the reality of our situation crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. The place was stunningly beautiful, a pristine wilderness of towering pine trees, their scent sharp and clean in the cool air. A nearby river rushed over rocks, its sound a constant, roaring whisper. Birds called to each other from the dense canopy. In any other life, this would have been paradise. For me, it had become the antechamber to my grave. My heart was pounding so violently I felt lightheaded. I gripped Henry's arm as we got out of the car, my legs feeling like they were made of rubber. Damien and Melissa unloaded their gear, their movements synchronized and efficient. They were smiling, joking with each other, the very image of a happy, adventurous couple. "Ready for the adventure?" Damien asked, slinging his heavy backpack onto his shoulders. He looked at us, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself to truly look into his eyes. And I saw it. Past the smile, past the feigned concern, past the 25-year performance, I saw the same cold, flat emptiness that must have been in his eyes when he looked at Richard at the edge of the gorge. The mask had a tiny crack, and the monster was staring out. The trail began easily enough, a soft, wide path carpeted with pine needles. It wound through lush, green forest, dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. Melissa walked ahead of us, her new camera constantly raised, capturing candid moments. "Oh, look at these wildflowers!" she exclaimed, pointing to a cluster of delicate yellow blossoms. "And listen, you can hear that woodpecker." Her performance was flawless, an Oscar-worthy portrayal of a daughter-in-law cherishing a day with her family. Damien positioned himself behind us. "Just to make sure you two don't fall behind," he said, his voice dripping with fake solicitude. But I could feel his gaze on our backs, a palpable pressure, like a knife point resting between my shoulder blades. Every time I glanced back, he offered that same practiced, empty smile. "How are you holding up, Mom, Dad?" he would ask every 15 minutes. "Need to take a break? Don't be shy." His faux concern was a razor blade wrapped in silk. He knew we were struggling. We were two 60-year-olds who were not prepared for this. Our breathing was becoming labored, our steps slower. They were exhausting us on purpose, softening us up for the kill. After about an hour, the trail began to change. It grew steeper, the path narrowing, the rocks becoming more loose and treacherous underfoot. My thighs burned with the effort, and Henry was breathing in ragged, painful-sounding gasps. We had to stop more frequently, leaning against trees, sipping from our water bottles with trembling hands. "We're almost at the lookout," Melissa called back to us, her voice bright with encouragement. But I had seen the map. I knew the real lookout was still far away. Her lie was a confirmation. They had no intention of reaching Eagle's Perch. The kill zone was much, much closer. As we trudged onward, I tried to force my terrified mind to be a camera. I memorized distinctive trees, one with a strange, gnarled branch shaped like a hand, another that was split down the middle but still alive. I noted a particular rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear. If, by some miracle, I survived, I would need to be able to lead the police back to this exact spot. Henry was doing the same, his eyes constantly scanning, cataloging. We were two condemned people memorizing the layout of our execution ground. Then, Melissa stopped ahead of us. "Oh, wow, look at that!" she cried, her voice pitched with feigned discovery. She was pointing to a sharp, rocky outcrop that jutted out from the main trail. It was accessible by a narrow, crumbling side path that looked far more dangerous than the one we were on. The rocks were loose shale, and there were few trees to grab for support, and from the top, it offered a sheer, 90-foot drop into a deep gorge littered with jagged boulders. It was perfect, isolated, dangerous, and deadly. "Why don't we climb up there to take some special photos?" Melissa suggested, her eyes wide with excitement. "The view from that cliff must be incredible." My blood, already cold, turned to solid ice. This was it. The place they had chosen. "I don't know if that's a good idea," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "That path looks pretty dangerous. For us." But Damien was already moving, stepping onto the treacherous side path without a moment's hesitation. "Come on, Mom," he said, using that same cajoling tone he'd used as a little boy when he wanted a second dessert. "It'll only take a few minutes. Melissa's right. The photos from up there are going to be spectacular." The way he said spectacular was a death sentence. Henry's hand found mine and gave it a discreet, desperate squeeze. The phone was recording. This was the point of no return. If we refused now, they would simply find another way, another day. This was our only chance to get the evidence we needed, to expose them for what they were. We had to walk into the lion's den. "Okay," I heard myself say, my voice a stranger's. "For the photos." The climb to the top of the cliff was a nightmare. The loose rocks slid and skittered under our feet. More than once, my ankle turned, a sharp spike of pain shooting up my leg. Henry grunted with effort, his face pale and slick with sweat. Damien helped us, his grip on my arm like a steel vise, the claws of the vulture finally making contact. When we finally reached the summit, the view was, indeed, spectacular. A vast, breathtaking panorama of the valley stretched out before us, the world laid out in a tapestry of green and blue. In any other circumstance, it would have been a moment of awe. Now, it was just the backdrop for our ending. "Come over here," Melissa called, positioning herself perilously close to the edge. "I want the valley in the background for the photos. It'll be perfect." Henry and I moved forward slowly, each step a conscious act of will. I could feel the void behind us, a palpable force pulling at our backs. Damien positioned himself strategically behind us, his body a wall blocking our retreat. "Perfect!" Melissa exclaimed, raising her camera. "Now hug each other and smile. A real, happy smile for your anniversary." Henry and I turned to each other and embraced. It was probably the last time we would ever hold each other. I buried my face in his jacket, inhaling his familiar scent of soap and sawdust one final time, trying to brand it into my soul forever. The camera flashed, once, twice, 3 times. Each burst of light felt like a gunshot. "Take one more," Damien suggested, his voice suddenly closer. He had moved right behind us. "But this time, take a step back. Just one. So the landscape frames you better. One step back, that was all it would take." One step back would put our heels on the very edge of the precipice. Henry and I exchanged one last, long look. It was a conversation of a lifetime contained in a single moment. Love, regret, apology, and a fierce, final determination. The time had come. We took the step back. The solid ground vanished. There was nothing behind us but air and a 90-foot drop onto stone. Melissa raised the camera one final time, but the sweet, excited expression was gone. Her face was a cold, hard mask of triumph. The performance was over. "Smile," she said, and her voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. "This is going to be your last photo." In that split second, Damien lunged. Chapter 5. The Unraveling. Damien lunged. It wasn't a frantic, desperate shove. It was a calculated, powerful thrust. His body a piston of murderous intent aimed squarely at our backs. His hands, the hands I had held when he learned to walk, the hands Henry had taught to hold a hammer, were now the instruments of our death. But Henry had been waiting for this. For 25 years, a part of him had been waiting. In the last possible second, he didn't try to dodge or grab for me. Instead, he spun with a speed I didn't know he still possessed. His own hands, gnarled and strong from a lifetime of work, shot out and locked like iron manacles around Damien's wrist. "If we're going to die," Henry roared, his voice a raw, primal thing I had never heard before, a sound torn from the very depths of his soul. "You're coming with us." The force of calming, Henry's pull, combined with Damien's own forward momentum, was catastrophic. Damien's eyes widened in shock, the cold calculation replaced by pure, animal panic. He hadn't anticipated this. He thought we were too helpless, aging sheep led to the slaughter. He didn't account for the cornered wolf my husband could become. For one horrifying, suspended moment, all 4 of us were a tangled, teetering mess on the cliff's edge, a macabre dance between life and death. Melissa screamed, a high, shrill sound of fury and fear, and she rushed forward, not to save us, but to try and pry Henry's hands from her husband. Her nails scratched at his arms, but his grip was unbreakable, fueled by a father's ultimate betrayal and a final, defiant love for me. The physics of it were inevitable. The weight was too much, the balance too precarious. I felt the ground, what little was left of it, crumble definitively under my feet. There was a sensation of terrible, weightless unmooring. Gravity, that silent, constant companion of a lifetime, now became an executioner. We fell. The world became a violent, screaming whirlwind. The air whistled past my ears, a deafening roar that swallowed Melissa's continued screams, Damien's choked cry, the sound of my own heart bursting in my chest. The beautiful, spectacular view of the valley became a nauseating kaleidoscope of spinning blue and green. I was tumbling, limbs flailing, completely at the mercy of the drop. In those seconds that stretched into an eternity, my mind, strangely clear, thought of Richard. I thought of my firstborn son, and I knew, with absolute certainty, exactly what he had felt in his final moments. The betrayal, the terror, the cold, hard impact waiting below. It came with a brutality that defied description. A sickening, wet crunch that was my own body breaking against the unyielding earth. A symphony of snapping and cracking that was both outside and inside of me. The pain was instantaneous and all-consuming, a white-hot fire that erased thought, erased fear, erased everything except pure, unadulterated agony. I felt something sharp and hot tear through my side. My head snapped back and connected with a rock, and a constellation of stars exploded behind my eyelids. The metallic taste of blood flooded my mouth, thick and coppery. This is it, I thought. This is death. But then, through the roaring in my ears and the symphony of pain, I heard it, a voice, weak, thready, but unmistakably his. "Hilda," Henry whispered, the word a ragged gasp. "Don't move, play dead." The command cut through the agony like a laser. Play dead. He was alive, and he had a plan. Even here, broken at the bottom of this hellhole, my husband was fighting for us. With a willpower I didn't know I possessed, a strength drawn from a well of love deeper than any pain, I forced my body to go limp. I stopped my frantic, gasping breaths, and let them become shallow, almost imperceptible flutters. I kept my eyes closed, though one was already swelling shut. I became a statue, a broken doll discarded among the rocks. The pain was a living thing inside me, screaming for release, but I smothered it. I focused everything I had on the sound of Henry's breathing a few feet away, using it as a lifeline. A few feet away, I could hear moans of pain. Damien and Melissa had survived the fall as well. But from the sound of their ragged, pained gasps, their situation was dire. "Melissa," Damien's voice was a broken thing, laced with pain. "Are you okay? Talk to me." I think my leg is broken," Melissa whimpered, her voice tight and shrill. "It hurts so much, Damien." "Oh God, it hurts." There was a moment of strained silence, filled only with their pained breathing. Then, Damien's voice, colder now, pragmatic. "And what about the old people? The old people?" The disrespect was so casual, so absolute, it confirmed everything. We had never been family to them. We were inventory. Assets, obstacles. I heard the sound of loose rocks shifting, the grunt of effort, as if Damien were trying to drag himself toward us. My heart hammered against my broken ribs, a frantic drumbeat I was terrified he would hear. I focused on being a corpse, a heavy, lifeless sack of flesh and bone. After a few minutes that felt like hours, he spoke again. "They're dead," he announced, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "Both of them. Their eyes are open, but they're not breathing." His lie filled me with a wild, incredulous hope. He believed it. Our performance was working. "Perfect," Melissa whispered, and the satisfaction in her voice was more chilling than any scream. "It worked. Just like we planned." "Well, except for the part where we fell, too," Damien snapped, his pain making him irritable. Melissa let out a bitter, pained laugh. "At least we won't have to pretend we love them anymore. No more listening to her boring stories about her students. No more pretending to care about his dusty old workshop." Each word was a fresh stab, twisting in the wounds they had already inflicted. The sheer depth of their contempt was a bottomless pit. For what felt like an eternity, they discussed their situation in low, urgent tones. Both were injured, but they could move. Damien's plan, now adapted, was to crawl until they found a spot with a cell signal, call for help, and then tell their rehearsed story of tragic, heroic survival. Remember the story, Damien instructed her, his voice a strained whisper. We were taking pictures. A rock came loose under Dad's feet. He stumbled, and when Mom tried to grab him, he pulled her over with him. We rushed to help, but the edge gave way, and we fell, too. It's crucial our stories match perfectly. I know, Melissa replied, her voice a mix of pain and impatience. We've practiced this 100 times. We're the traumatized survivors of a family tragedy. Poor us, we lost our dear-in-laws in a horrible, fluke accident. Her performance was so convincing, so layered, with false grief, that if I hadn't been lying there as one of the supposed corpses, I would have believed every word. They were monsters, but they were brilliant, dedicated monsters. Gradually, the sound of their movement, of rocks scraping, and their pained grunts, faded into the distance. They were crawling away, leaving us for dead, on their way to play the grieving couple for the cameras and the police. When the silence finally fell, thick and heavy, Henry whispered my name again, so low it was almost carried away by the breeze. Hilda, are you okay? I answered in the same, breathy whisper, my voice strange and rough to my own ears. I'm here. I'm alive. But I'm bad, Henry. Really bad. My left leg is broken, he told me, his voice choked with pain. And I think I have several fractured ribs. I can't move my leg at all. What about you? I did a mental inventory of the wreckage of my body. A stabbing, relentless pain in my right arm that suggested a break. A deep, throbbing agony in my shoulder that was definitely dislocated. My head pounded in rhythm with my heartbeat, and every breath sent a fresh wave of fire through my chest. But I was conscious, I was alive. And that was a miracle I hadn't dared to hope for. We're bad, I whispered back. But we're alive. The phone, did it? It was recording, he confirmed. It should have everything. But there's no signal down here, no way to call for help. That was the most terrifying part of our new reality. We were alive, but we were trapped at the bottom of a remote gorge, critically injured, with no way to call for help. If the rescuers only listened to Damien and Melissa's story, they might not even search this area thoroughly. We could die here slowly, from our injuries, from thirst, from exposure, after having survived the fall itself. The irony was a bitter pill. We had escaped murder, only to be delivered to a slow, natural death. Henry, I whispered, the words tasting of blood. It's too late. I need you to tell me everything, no more secrets. Everything that really happened the night Richard died. My husband sighed deeply, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of 25 years of silence and guilt. It was the sound of a man finally ready to unburden his soul at the gates of hell itself. That night, he began, his voice trembling but clear, Richard came to find me in the workshop. He was furious. He had papers in his hands, bank statements. He showed me undeniable evidence that Damien had been stealing from our accounts for months. The physical pain mingled with the emotional as I finally heard the unvarnished truth. The small insidious thefts, the brother playing detective, the confrontation I never knew was brewing under the roof I thought was safe. Richard wanted to confront him that same night. Henry continued, his voice gaining a little strength as he unspooled the long-held secret. I tried to calm him down, Hilda. I begged him to wait until the next day, when we could all sit down together, when heads were cooler, but he was so angry. He said he couldn't sleep knowing his own brother was a thief, that he was betraying us, betraying the family. And you followed him? I asked, though I knew the answer. I needed to hear him say it. I needed the full, horrible picture. I followed him because I was afraid, Henry confessed, his voice thick with regret. I knew Richard's temper when his sense of justice was provoked. And I also knew. I had noticed something changing in Damien. A coldness, a resentment that was growing like a weed. It sent chills down my spine, but I never imagined. I never let myself imagine. When I got to the gorge, he said, and I could hear the tears in his voice now. I found them screaming at each other. Richard had the papers, waving them in Damien's face. "You're a thief," he was yelling. "You're stealing from our own parents." And Damien, he denied everything. He called Richard crazy, paranoid, said he was making it up to make himself look better. My heart ached, picturing the scene. My two boys, the light and the shadow, locked in a battle that could only end in tragedy. "What happened next, Henry?" I whispered, bracing myself. He was silent for a long time, gathering the strength to speak the unspeakable. Richard told him that if he didn't return every penny and confess to us, he would tell us everything himself, that he wouldn't protect him anymore. And Damien, he just went berserk. He screamed that Richard had always been the favorite, that he had always had everything easy, that it was his turn. And then, Henry's voice broke completely. Then Damien pushed him. "Hilda. It wasn't an accident, it was deliberate." He pushed him with all his strength. I saw Richard's arms flailing, saw him desperately trying to grab onto something, anything. But it was too late. Tears streamed from my eyes, mingling with the blood on my face. The final, horrible truth. It was murder, plain and simple. "Why?" I sobbed, the word a ragged tear in the quiet air. "Why did you never tell me the truth?" "Because when I got to where Damien was standing," Henry said, his voice a raw wound, he was crying, trembling, telling me over and over that it was an accident, that he hadn't meant for it to happen. He begged me not to tell you. He said he couldn't lose you too. He was my son, Hilda. My only surviving son. How could I turn him over to the police? How could I destroy what was left of our family? His justification was a tragedy in itself. A father's love, twisted into a weapon that had ultimately been turned against us. "And the money," I pressed, needing the full, sordid account. "Damien promised he would return it," Henry said, a hollow laugh escaping him. "Little by little. He swore it was a one-time mistake, a moment of desperation. He swore on Richard's memory, and I, like a fool, I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe my son wasn't a killer. But he never returned a single penny. He kept stealing, and I kept silent. Every day that passed, I became more of his accomplice. I was so afraid of losing you, of destroying our family, that I ended up helping him destroy it from the inside out." We lay there in silence for a moment, two broken bodies surrounded by the broken pieces of our lives. The truth, now fully revealed, was a heavy blanket, smothering and cold. Just then, we heard it, faint but unmistakable. Voices in the distance. Damien and Melissa had found help. The hospital room was a sterile, fluorescent-lit world of beeping machines and hushed, urgent voices. I lay on the gurney, a passive doll as doctors and nurses moved around me with practiced efficiency. My body was a map of agony, my broken arm had been splinted, my dislocated shoulder was a deep, throbbing misery, and the pain in my head and ribs was a constant, screaming presence. But the physical pain was almost a welcome distraction from the psychological torment of the act I had to maintain. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing a shallow, barely perceptible flutter. I was a statue of a dying woman, and every second was a battle against the instinct to scream, to sit up, to demand justice. I focused on the sounds around me, using them to build a picture of my surroundings. The squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. The soft hiss of the oxygen feeding into the mask over my nose and mouth. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor they had attached to me, a sound I had to consciously keep slow and weak. Through my slitted eyelids, I could see the blurry form of a young nurse checking my IV. Her name tag read Inz's. She had a kind, tired face, and her movements were gentle as she adjusted the drip. The door to the room swished open, and I heard the doctor's voice. "Stable, but it's touch and go. The next few hours will be crucial. We've done everything we can." Then, I heard Melissa's voice, a masterpiece of manufactured grief. A soft, choked sob. Can we see them? Just for a moment. We need to say goodbye, just in case. My blood ran cold. This was the moment I had been dreading. The confrontation. The doctor's voice was gentle. Of course. Just for a few minutes. Be gentle with them. The air in the room changed as they entered. It grew heavier, charged with a malevolent hypocrisy that I could feel on my skin. I heard their footsteps approach my bed. It was the most dangerous moment of my life. I had to convince the people who had pushed me off a cliff that I was now on the verge of dying from my injuries. I felt a presence on my left side. Damien. His shadow fell over me. Then, his hand touched mine. It was all I could do not to recoil, not to snatch my hand back from the vile, calculating touch of my son's murderer. His skin was cool, his grip tentative. "Mom," he whispered, his voice a low, intimate murmur meant only for my ears. "If you can hear me, I want you to know that I love you. I'm so sorry this happened." The words were poison, each one a lie designed for the ears of the nurse in the room. But then he leaned in closer, so close I could feel his breath on my ear. His voice dropped even further, becoming a venomous, guttural whisper that the heart monitor could never pick up. "I hope you've learned your lesson, Mom. You should never have asked so many questions about our finances. Some truths are better left buried, just like Richard." The world stopped. The beeping of the monitors, the distant hospital sounds, everything faded into a dull roar. He had confessed. Right here, in this sterile room, he had admitted it. He had linked our questions to our accident, and he had mentioned Richard. He had just handed us the final piece of evidence. But I had no recorder. Henry's phone was with him, in another room. This confession was for me alone. A final, cruel taunt from a son, too. The mother he believed was already as good as dead. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Nurse Innes freeze. Her hand, which had been adjusting the IV bag, went still. Her head turned slightly, and I saw her eyes widen in shock and dawning horror. She had heard it. She had heard the malice in that whisper, the mention of a buried truth and a dead brother. Her professional composure cracked for a single, telling second. "What did you say about Richard?" Melissa whispered sharply from the other side of the bed, her voice tight with alarm. She, too, had heard the dangerous slip. Damien tensed, pulling back slightly. I could feel the sudden rigidity in his hand. "Nothing," he muttered, his tone suddenly flustered. "I just meant, well, Mom always wondered what really happened that night. I guess it doesn't matter anymore." But it did matter. And Melissa was sharp enough to know her husband had just made a catastrophic error. "Damien," she said, her voice tense and commanding. "Let's go. The doctors need space to work." I could feel the silent, furious communication passing between them. The mutual understanding that the perfect performance had just developed a critical crack. Their footsteps retreated, and the door swished shut behind them. The moment they were gone, the atmosphere in the room shifted again. Nurse Innes did not immediately return to her work. She stood by my bed for a long moment, perfectly still. Then, she moved. She pretended to check the monitors, her back to the door. She leaned in very close, her voice a breath so faint I could barely perceive it. "Ma'am," she whispered. "I know you can hear me. What I just heard, that is not normal. If you are in danger, you need to tell me somehow." A wild, desperate hope bloomed in my chest, so powerful it was a physical pain. An ally. We had an ally. Very slowly, with an immense effort of control, I moved the index finger of my uninjured hand. It was the smallest possible twitch, a movement that could be mistaken for a muscle spasm. Innes saw it, her breath hitched. "Oh my God," she breathed, almost inaudibly. "You're pretending." I moved my finger again, twice. "Okay, listen," she said, her voice low and urgent. She leaned in even closer, her cheek almost touching mine as she pretended to listen to my breathing. "I'm going to pretend I'm checking your monitors. If you are in danger from those people who were just here, move your finger 3 times. Without a moment's hesitation, I moved my finger 3 distinct times. Ins gasped softly. They did this to you. 3 more movements. The nurse straightened up, her face a pale mask of controlled panic. She busied herself with my chart, her mind clearly racing. I could see the war on her face, professional protocol versus basic human decency. Finally, she made her decision. She approached me one last time. I'm going to talk to the doctor in charge, she whispered, her voice firm now. But I need you to keep pretending until we can protect you. Do you understand? I moved my finger once. Yes. She gave a sharp, barely perceptible nod, and then left the room. Her footsteps hurried. The next few minutes were an agony of suspense, far worse than any physical pain. I was alone, completely vulnerable. What if she changed her mind? What if she told the doctor, and he dismissed it as the ramblings of a traumatized nurse? What if Damien and Melissa came back? Finally, I heard footsteps returning. More than one set. The door opened, and I sensed multiple people entering the room. It was Inns, accompanied by an older man in a white coat, the chief doctor, and miraculously, 2 police officers in uniform. Ma'am, the doctor said, his voice low and calm. Nurse Inns has told us about your situation. If you can hear me, you need to know that you are safe now. The officers are here to protect you. A wave of relief so profound washed over me that I almost lost control of my breathing. We had done it. We had reached the authorities. Can you open your eyes? One of the officers asked. He had a kind, serious face and the calm demeanor of someone used to crises. Slowly, fighting against the swelling and the disorientation, I opened my eyes. The bright fluorescent light was blinding, and I blinked several times before my vision cleared. I saw the worried faces of the doctor, Nurse Inns, and the 2 officers surrounding my bed. Thank God, Inns murmured, her hand going to her heart. I thought I was going crazy. Ma'am, said the officer who had spoken first. I'm Detective Johnson. We understand you may be in a very dangerous situation. Can you tell us what really happened on that mountain? My voice, when it came, was a raspy, broken thing, shredded by trauma and disuse. My son, I whispered, the words tearing at my raw throat. My son and his wife, they pushed us. The room was utterly silent. Detective Johnson's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were sharp, focused. They pushed you, he repeated, confirming. Yes, I croaked. They planned it. For the money. Our will, the inheritance. It was difficult to form complete sentences. The doctor immediately intervened. She needs to conserve her strength. This can wait. No, I insisted, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. This couldn't wait. There's evidence. My husband, Henry, he recorded everything. On his phone. From the hike, their confessions, everything is on his phone. Detective Johnson's eyes lit up. Your husband has recorded evidence? Yes, I said, my energy already flagging. Everything. The phone, it's with him. The detective immediately turned to the other officer. Stay with her, no one comes in without my authorization. He then followed the doctor out of the room, heading for Henry's room. The next hour was a blur. The police officer stood guard by my door while nurses tended to me more openly now, their touches gentle, their voices soft with a new kind of respect. I learned that Henry had regained consciousness shortly after me. When Detective Johnson explained the situation to him, he had handed over his phone without hesitation. The recording is clear, Detective Johnson announced when he returned to my room, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. We have explicit confessions about the plan, admissions about financial pressure, and clear evidence of premeditated attempted murder. It's more than enough to arrest them, but... Are you going to arrest them here? I asked, a fresh wave of fear washing over me. What if they realize we're alive and talking? We already have officers positioned near the waiting room. the detective assured me. As soon as the arrest warrant is signed, we'll take them in. You are both under police protection now. They won't get near you. The irony was almost beautiful. Damien and Melissa were likely still in some waiting room, performing their grief for anyone who would listen, receiving condolences, perhaps even beginning to discuss the details of our funeral and the distribution of our estate. They had no idea that just a few corridors away, the trap was about to spring shut. "Is there anything else?" the detective asked, pulling out a small notepad. I told him everything, as coherently as I could. Richard's murder, the stolen money, the pressure about the will and the house, the entire, sordid history. He listened intently, his face a mask of professional calm. But I could see the revulsion in his eyes. "After hearing your story," he said, "we did some preliminary digging into your son's finances. It's worse than you thought. He's not just bankrupt, he owes significant money to some very dangerous, unofficial lenders. The kind who don't take excuses." A new chilling dimension was added to the betrayal. "You mean we weren't just an inconvenience?" "You were his only lifeline," the detective confirmed. "With your inheritance, he could have paid off his debts and started over. Without it, he would probably have been dead within weeks. This wasn't just about greed, it was about survival. Our deaths weren't just convenient, they were essential. The motive was even more desperate, and therefore, even more monstrous." "And what will happen to our grandchildren?" I asked, the thought of those innocent children a fresh pain. "Social services will take temporary custody," he replied gently. "But as I understand it, once you recover, you could petition for custody. They're your family." The idea was overwhelming. To raise the children of the people who tried to murder us. But they were innocent. They deserved a chance at a real family, a real home, not the toxic web of lies they came from. "It's time," the detective said, as another officer entered the room and handed him a folder. "The warrants are signed. We're going to arrest them now." From my hospital bed, I couldn't see the arrest, but I could imagine it. The sterile waiting room, the shocked faces of other visitors, the firm, official voices cutting through the false narrative Damien and Melissa had so carefully constructed. I heard it through the officer's radio, a crackling, distant transmission that was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "Damien Black and Melissa Black. You are under arrest for the murder of Richard Black and the attempted murder of Hilda and Henry Black." There was a moment of dead silence on the radio, followed by Melissa's hysterical, shrill voice. "What are you talking about? We're the victims here. Our in-laws died in an accident." "Ma'am," the officer's calm voice replied, "your in-laws are alive, and they have provided complete evidence of your crimes." Another silence. Then, a raw, desperate scream from Damien. "That's impossible. We saw them die. They were dead." His involuntary, panicked confession was captured for everyone to hear. Then, the alliance of lies shattered completely. I heard Melissa's voice, sharp and frantic, through the radio. "It was all his idea. I didn't want to do any of this. He forced me." And Damien, in turn, screamed back, "You were the one who suggested the cliff. You planned all of this." Their perfect world, built on a foundation of murder and deceit, collapsed in a matter of seconds, as they turned on each other with the viciousness of cornered rats. Detective Johnson returned to my room a while later, his expression a mix of satisfaction and profound sadness. "They're arrested and on their way to the station," he informed me. "They're both trying to blame the other, which only makes our case stronger. But there's one more thing." He held up a small, black digital recorder. "We found this in your son's backpack. He'd been recording his conversations with you and your husband for weeks. He knew you were getting suspicious. The mountain trip wasn't a spontaneous idea. It was a direct response to you discovering the truth. The cold, calculating depth of it was breathtaking. They hadn't just been planning our murder. They had been monitoring us, assessing the threat level we posed. We were lab rats, and they were the scientists noting our every twitch of suspicion. "There's more," the detective continued. "The financial investigation shows he had already forged your signatures on several documents, trying to access your accounts. If you had died on that mountain, he would have had immediate access to everything. The betrayal was absolute. It was a poison that had seeped into every corner of our lives. But as I lay there in that hospital bed, surrounded by protectors instead of predators, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. It was fragile, and it was born from utter devastation, but it was there. It was peace. The gambit was over. We had won. The days that followed the arrest were a surreal whirlwind, a limbo between the horror of what had been and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Henry and I were moved to a secure, private wing of the hospital, a guard stationed outside our doors at all times. The police protection was a tangible comfort, a barrier against the world that had suddenly become so dangerous. Yet, the real battle was now internal, fought in the quiet moments between police interviews and medical checks. My physical body was on the mend, slowly knitting itself back together. The broken bones were set, the deep bruises faded from violent purples and blacks to sickly yellows and greens. But the wounds on my soul were another matter. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that cliff, feeling the push, the terrifying weightlessness, the brutal impact. I heard Damien's whispered confession in my ear, felt Melissa's cold, calculating gaze. The images were seared into my memory, a permanent horror show I was forced to relive. Henry, in the room next to mine, was recovering more slowly. His injuries had been more severe: the broken leg, the multiple fractured ribs, a punctured lung that had required surgery. But it was the guilt that was crippling him. He would hold my hand when I visited his bedside, his grip weak, his eyes shadowed with a pain no medication could touch. "I let this happen, Hilda," he whispered one afternoon, his voice raspy from the breathing tube that had been down his throat. "I planted this seed 25 years ago when I chose to hide the truth. I watered it every time I looked the other way while he stole from us. I gave it sunlight when I defended him to you. I built the monster that tried to kill us. I squeezed his hand, my own heart aching for him. We both built him, Henry," I said, my voice soft. I was blind. I saw only what I wanted to see. We loved a ghost, a performance. The real Damien. We lost him a long time ago. The legal machinery ground into motion with a grim, relentless efficiency. Our lawyer, Albert, visited us, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a grave seriousness. He laid out the case for us. It was, as Detective Johnson had said, overwhelming. "The recording from Henry's phone is damning," Albert explained, adjusting his glasses. "We have them discussing the plan, Melissa's comment about not having to pretend to love them anymore, their entire rehearsed story about the loose rock. Combined with the financial records, the forged documents, and their confessions during the arrest where they implicated each other, it's a prosecutor's dream." But then he delivered the blow we had been anticipating, yet still dreaded. "Their defense attorneys, however, are pushing for a plea bargain," Albert said, his lips pressed into a thin line. "They're arguing it wasn't premeditated murder, but a crime of passion. They're claiming Damien was under extreme financial duress, that he snapped under the pressure, that it was a desperate, tragic decision made in a moment of panic. A fire of pure, white-hot fury ignited in my chest. "A crime of passion?" I repeated, my voice trembling with indignation. "They bought special equipment. They chose the perfect location. They rehearsed their story. They recorded us for weeks to gauge our suspicions. How much more premeditated can you get?" Albert nodded grimly. "I know, and we have the evidence to prove it. But to ensure they get the sentences they deserve, to counter this narrative, the prosecution will need you. Both of you. To testify." The room seemed to shrink. The idea of facing Damien in a courtroom, of sitting mere feet away from him, of looking into the eyes of the boy I raised and the man who tried to kill me, was utterly paralyzing. I would have to relive every moment, in excruciating detail, under the cold, bright lights of a public trial, while he sat and watched. "It will be emotionally devastating," Albert warned, his voice gentle but firm. "But your testimony is the heart of this case. It's what will make the jury understand that this wasn't a moment of desperation, but the culmination of a lifetime of deception and evil." Henry, lying pale in his hospital bed, met my eyes. In his, I saw the same terror, the same revulsion. But I also saw a newfound steel, the same steel that had made him grab Damien's wrist on that cliff. "We'll do it," Henry said, his voice weak but unwavering. "For Richard." 3 weeks after the arrest, we were finally discharged from the hospital. Going home was one of the most disorienting experiences of my life. The house was exactly as we had left it on that Saturday morning, frozen in time. The breakfast dishes were still in the sink, a monument to our last meal of innocence. Our bed was unmade, the sheets still holding the impression of our bodies from the night we had held each other, whispering what we thought might be our final goodbyes. And on the kitchen table, the flowers Damien had brought me the week before the trip stood in their vase. Now a brittle, brown skeleton of their former selves, their petals littering the table like ash. It was a ghost house. Every room echoed with the laughter of a family that had never truly existed. That first night back, as we lay in our familiar bed, Henry with his leg in a cast, me with my arm in a sling, the silence was deafening. "Do you think we'll ever be happy again?" I asked into the darkness, the question a fragile thing. Henry was quiet for a long time. Then, he sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of our broken world. "I don't know, Hilda," he said honestly, his hand finding mine. "But we're alive. We have the truth on our side. And for the first time in 25 years, we don't have to live with secrets. That has to count for something." The trial began 6 months later. The media had dubbed it the Cliffside Betrayal, and reporters swarmed the courthouse. We had to enter through a back entrance, shielded by officers, their faces a blur of microphones and shouted questions. The day I had to testify was the longest of my life. I walked into the courtroom, my legs trembling, my good hand clutching Henry's arm for support. And then I saw him, Damien. He sat at the defense table, wearing a suit, his hair neatly trimmed. He looked ordinary. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like my son. And that was the most horrifying part of all. As I took the stand and swore to tell the truth, I forced myself to look at him. I searched his face, his eyes, for any sign of the boy I had loved, any flicker of remorse, of pain, of humanity. There was nothing. His gaze was flat, impenetrable, a wall of cold indifference. The mask was gone, but what was underneath was not the son I remembered. It was a void. I testified for hours. I told them about the perfect family, about Richard's light, about the new Damien who had emerged after the funeral. I spoke of the will, the pressure to sell the house, the demand for power of attorney. My voice shook as I described Henry's confession about Richard's murder, the stolen money, the decades of lies. And then, I recounted the trip to the mountains. The recording was played for the jury, their confessions echoing in the hushed courtroom. I described the push, the fall, the impact, and Henry's life-saving whisper. I told them about playing dead, about listening to them confirm their guilt above our broken bodies. It was a public evisceration. I laid my soul, my family, my entire life, bare for the jury, the judge, the world to see. When I was finally finished, the prosecutor asked if I had anything I wanted to say directly to the court. I turned from him and looked directly at Damien. The room was so quiet you could hear the rustle of the court reporter's fingers on her machine. "Damien," I said, my voice clear and steady now, stripped of all fear. "I don't know who you are, but you are no longer my son. My son died the night you killed Richard, and what has been living in his place for 25 years is a monster that we, unwittingly helped to create. I mourn the boy you were. I despise the man you became. and I will spend the rest of my life ensuring you never harm anyone ever again." There was not a single flicker of emotion on his face. He simply stared back, a stranger in my son's skin. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they filed back in, their faces were solemn. The verdicts were read, one after another. Guilty. Guilty of the first-degree murder of Richard Black. Guilty. Guilty of the attempted first-degree murder of Hilda and Henry Black. Melissa received the same convictions. Both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no dramatic outburst, no crying. Damien simply stood, allowed the bailiff to cuff him, and was led away. He never looked back. Melissa, however, collapsed into hysterical sobs, a final pathetic performance for an audience that had long since stopped believing her. It was over. Now, 1 year later, the sharp edges of the pain have begun to soften, worn down by time and the quiet rhythms of a new life. Henry's leg has healed, though he walks with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the fall. My arm is out of the sling, though it aches when it rains. The physical scars are fading. The emotional scars are another matter. They are a part of us, now, woven into the fabric of who we are. We sold the old house. We couldn't live in that museum of ghosts and lies. We bought a smaller place, on the other side of town, with a sunny yard and no workshop in the back. It's a fresh start, a blank page. And we are not alone. The most beautiful, and the most complicated, part of our new life is the children. Damien and Melissa's children. Our grandchildren. After a lengthy process with social services, Henry and I were granted full custody. They are beautiful, innocent souls, too young to understand the full, horrible truth about their parents. To them, we are grandma and grandpa, their safe harbor in a storm they never saw coming. Every night, when I tuck them into their beds in our new, peaceful home, I tell them stories. I tell them about their Uncle Richard. I tell them about his kindness, his booming laugh, his dream of building great things. I tell them he was a hero, which is the truth. I keep his memory alive, not as a ghost of tragedy, but as a beacon of the goodness that was stolen from this world. We are building a new kind of family, one rooted not in perfection, but in truth, in resilience. It is a family born from ruin, from the ashes of betrayal, but it is built with a love that is real and fierce and unbreakable. The perfect picture is gone forever, shattered on the rocks of a river gorge, but in its place we are painting something new. It's not a perfect picture, it has shadows and cracks and painful memories. But it is honest, and for the first time in a very, very long time, it is safe. We are home. The first anniversary of the trial came and went, marked not by a celebration, but by a quiet, mutual understanding between Henry and me. We didn't need to speak of it. We spent the day in the garden of our new home, our hands buried in the soil, tending to the roses and the nascent vegetable patches. There was a therapy in the physicality of it, in nurturing something and watching it grow. It was the antithesis of the destruction we had endured. Our grandchildren, Leo and Clara, were the vibrant, noisy heart of our new world. But with their joy came constant, subtle reminders. Leo, now 7, had begun to ask more complex questions. The simple, "Mommy and Daddy did bad things" was no longer enough to satisfy his growing mind. He came to me one afternoon, his brow furrowed in a way that was so painfully familiar it made my chest ache. "Grandma Hilda," he began, his voice small and serious. "At school, Jake said his dad is in prison because he stole a car." "Is that why my dad is in prison? Did he steal a car?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. I looked at his earnest, confused face and knew the time for half-truths was over. We had to build their future on a foundation of honesty, no matter how painful. I sat him down on the sofa, pulling Clara onto my lap. Henry, sensing the gravity of the moment, put down his whittling and joined us, his hand finding mine. "No, Leo," I said, choosing my words with immense care. He didn't steal a car. He hurt people. He hurt Uncle Richard, and he hurt Grandpa and me. Very badly. Leo's eyes widened. He hurt you. The concept was clearly alien to him. In his world, parents and grandparents were safe. They were protectors. He did, Henry said, his voice gentle but firm. He made some very, very bad choices, choices that hurt our family deeply. And when people make choices that hurt others that badly, they have to go to a place called prison to keep everyone else safe. And we don't get to see him anymore? Clara piped up, her lower lip trembling. Not for a very, very long time, I said, hugging her close. But you have us. You will always have us. And we love you more than anything in the whole world. It was a difficult conversation, heavy and somber, but a necessary one. We saw a new understanding dawn in their eyes, not of the full, horrific truth, but of the basic principle that actions have consequences, and that some actions are so grave they break families apart. We were, in a way, inoculating them against the poison of their parents' legacy by teaching them about integrity. The other echo came in the form of a letter. It arrived in a plain, white envelope with the Department of Corrections return address. My hands trembled as I held it. It was from Damien. I didn't open it immediately. I left it on the kitchen table for a full day, a silent, ominous presence. Henry and I would glance at it, then look away, as if it were a live grenade. Are you going to read it? Henry finally asked that evening, after the children were asleep. I don't know, I whispered. What could he possibly say? What words could ever be enough? Maybe it's not about enough, Henry said, his gaze distant. Maybe it's just noise. Curiosity, that old, treacherous serpent, eventually won. With Henry sitting beside me, I carefully slit the envelope open. The letter was not long. The handwriting was neat, controlled, devoid of the frantic energy I had somehow expected. Mom, Dad, I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I know that's not possible. I'm not even sure why I'm writing. I guess I just wanted to put some things down on paper. Prison is a place of silence and noise. The noise is constant yelling, gates clanging. But the real prison is the silence inside my own head. It's in that silence that I see it all. Richard's face. The gorge. The cliff. I've been assigned to a therapist. She says I have to take responsibility. She uses words like narcissism and sociopathic tendencies. They're just words. They don't capture the coldness. The calculation. I look back on my life, and I see a stranger living it. A stranger who thought he was entitled to everything, who saw love as a transaction, and family as an obstacle. I remember you telling me once, Mom, that Richard wanted to build bridges. I only ever built traps. And in the end, I fell into the deepest one myself. I don't expect a reply. I don't deserve one. I needed you to know that the stranger in my skin, he sees what he did now. And there is no one to blame but himself. Damien, I let the letter fall to the table. There were no tears this time. Just a profound, hollow sadness. It wasn't an apology, it was an autopsy. A clinical dissection of a poor monster by the monster himself. There was no emotion, no remorse, only a cold, intellectual recognition of his own pathology. Henry picked it up, read it, and let out a long, slow breath. He's still in there, he said, his voice thick with a grief I now shared. But he's a prisoner, too. A prisoner of that stranger he talks about. We did not reply. Some bridges, once burned, cannot and should not be rebuilt. The letter was not a plea for connection. It was a message in a bottle from a ship that had sunk long ago. We acknowledged it, and we let it go. Throwing it into the fire felt like a final, necessary ritual. Life, in its stubborn, beautiful way, continued to push us forward. Leo won a prize at his school's science fair for a model of the solar system. Clara lost her first tooth, and we played the part of the Tooth Fairy with a gusto we didn't know we still possessed. Henry sold one of his hand-carved bird sculptures at a local craft fair, not for the money, but for the quiet pride it gave him. We are building a new family tapestry. The threads are different now, darker, coarser in places, woven with grief and resilience. The pattern is not the perfect, symmetrical one I had once envisioned. It is more complex, more interesting. It has shadows that give the light its meaning. The echoes of the past will always be with us. The whisper of play dead in a quiet moment. The glimpse of Damien in Leo's smile. The weight of a secret finally laid bare. But they are echoes now, not the deafening roar they once were. We have learned that after the reckoning, there is not just ruin, there is also regrowth. It is slow, it is painful. But it is possible. We are living proof. Our story is no longer about the son who pushed us. It is about the grandparents who chose to stay, to love, and to build again, right here in the quiet, sunlit peace of our garden, with the echoes of the past fading slowly into the gentle hum of a life reclaimed. Peace, we discovered, was not a final destination, but a series of small, daily choices. It was choosing to focus on the vibrant red of a cardinal visiting our bird feeder instead of the dark memory its sudden flight might trigger. It was Henry choosing to sand a piece of wood in the garage, the rhythmic sound a meditation that slowly smoothed his own internal rough edges. It was me reading a story to Clara, losing myself in the simple cadence of her breathing as she fell asleep, a trust so absolute it felt like a balm. But trauma is an uninvited guest that never truly leaves. It just learns to live with you, sometimes quiet and unobtrusive, other times making its presence violently known. For Henry, it was the rain. A heavy, persistent downpour began one evening, drumming a relentless rhythm on our cottage roof. I found him standing by the back door, staring out into the slick, dark garden, his shoulders tense. "It sounds like the river," he said, his voice barely audible over the downpour. The night I followed them. The river was loud, swollen from the rain. I can still hear it, Hilda. I can still smell the wet earth and the pine, and I can feel the dread in my stomach, knowing I was too late. I came to stand beside him, not touching him, just sharing the space. He wasn't here with me in our safe, dry kitchen. He was 25 years in the past, on a path leading to his eldest son's murder. These moments were his prison, far more inescapable than the one Damien now inhabited. All I could do was wait, a silent anchor, until the memory released its grip and he returned to me, his face pale and exhausted. For me, the trigger was a name. A new student had joined my weekly literacy volunteer group at the library. A bright, curious little boy named Richard. The first time I called his name, my voice caught in my throat. A simple, common name, yet it felt like a shard of glass in my soul. For the rest of the session, I was acutely aware of him, my gaze drawn to him, with a mixture of aching fondness and a grief so fresh it surprised me. I saw my Richard in his eager hand, raised high to answer a question. I saw him in the way he concentrated, his small tongue peeking out from the corner of his mouth. It was a bittersweet agony, a reminder of what was lost, yet also a testament to the enduring echo of a good soul. We were learning the geography of our new emotional landscape, mapping its treacherous valleys and finding its small, sunlit clearings. The children were our greatest guides in this. Their needs were immediate, physical, and pure. They pulled us out of our own heads and into the present moment. Leo needed help with his model of the Roman Colosseum. Clara needed a bandage for a scraped knee and a song to make it better. They fought over the last pancake at breakfast and giggled uncontrollably at silly jokes. Their normalcy was our therapy. And then, the outside world intruded in a way we hadn't anticipated. A journalist from a national true crime magazine found us. She was polite, persistent, and her letter was a masterclass in feigned empathy. She wrote of wanting to tell a story of resilience and the redemptive power of family, of giving us a platform to reclaim our narrative. She used all the right words, but I could read the hunger between the lines. She didn't want our story of healing. She wanted the salacious details of the betrayal, the fall, the courtroom drama. Henry wanted to burn the letter. "We've been through enough. We don't owe our pain to anyone," he said, his voice hard. But I hesitated. For months, we had been defined by Damien's crime. We were the victims, the survivors. This woman was offering, however disingenuously, a chance to define ourselves as something else. To talk about Leo and Clara, to talk about the garden and Henry's birds. To talk about the slow, difficult work of putting a life back together. "What if," I said slowly, "we use it? Not for her, but for us. What if we lay down our terms? We don't talk about the cliff. We don't talk about the trial. We talk about now. We talk about what comes after." Henry looked at me, skepticism etched on his face. "You think she'll agree to that?" "I think we have the power here, Henry," I said, a newfound strength in my voice. "Our story is ours. We decide which chapters to read aloud." After much discussion, we agreed. I wrote a brief, clear email to the journalist, outlining our conditions. To my surprise, she agreed. The day of the interview, she arrived with a single, small recorder, no camera. She was younger than I expected, and her eyes held a keen intelligence that made me wary. We sat in our sunlit living room, the children playing quietly in the next room. We spoke of the difficulty of explaining the unexplainable to a child. We spoke of the support we'd found in my sister Harriet and a small, trusted circle of friends who had never judged us for the sins of our son. Henry, hesitantly at first, spoke about his whittling, how the focus required quieted the noise in his head. I spoke of the library, of the profound satisfaction of helping a child unlock the magic of words. We talked about the fragile ecosystem of a family after a catastrophe. We talked about the choice, made every single morning, to live in the present rather than the past. The journalist listened, her recorder whirring softly. She asked thoughtful questions, never pushing, never probing for the gory details we had sworn to avoid. When she left, she thanked us for our honesty. Weeks later, the article was published. We braced ourselves, but it was respectful. It was titled, "After the Fall: Building a New Life on the Ruins of Betrayal." It focused almost entirely on what we had wanted it to: our recovery, our grandchildren, our quiet, deliberate creation of a new kind of family. Our tragedy was the backdrop, not the headline. Damien and Melissa were mentioned only in passing. Their crimes noted as the catalyst, but not the story itself. Reading it was a strange, cathartic experience. It was the first time we had seen our lives reflected back at us not as a true crime spectacle, but as a human story of endurance. We had, in a small way, reclaimed our narrative. That night, as we sat on our new, smaller porch, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, Henry took my hand. "You were right," he said softly. "We're not just what happened to us, we're what we did after." The uninvited guest of trauma would always have a room in our house, but we were no longer its prisoners, we were the landlords. And we were finally deciding how the place was run. The echoes were still there, but we were learning to speak over them, our voices growing stronger with every word of our new, chosen story. The letter from the state arrived on a Tuesday, nestled between a seed catalog and a bill. It was formal, printed on thick, official paper. It was a notification of Damien's institutional transfer. He was being moved to a maximum security facility hundreds of miles away, a place for long-term, high-security inmates. The letter was cold, bureaucratic, and for us, it felt like a period at the end of a horrifying sentence. It was the final, physical severance. The last, faint thread of proximity, the abstract knowledge that he was in a prison in our own state was cut. He was being cast adrift, and in a way, so were we. The news settled in our quiet cottage, with a profound and complicated weight. Henry took the letter out to the garage. I didn't follow him. I knew he needed to be with his wood, with the simple, honest process of creation, to process this. The sound of his saw, rhythmic and sure, was his prayer, his meditation, his fury, and his grief, all expressed in the language he understood best. For me, the news manifested as a strange, restless energy. I found myself in the children's room, meticulously folding clothes they would quickly outgrow, straightening pictures on the wall, actions that were orderly and controllable in the face of a reality that was not. This transfer was a confirmation. It wasn't a temporary holding cell. It was the place he would grow old. It was the place he would die. The finality of it was a door slamming shut in a corridor of our lives we had already boarded up, but the echo of the slam was deafening. A week later, my sister Harriet came to visit. She found me in the garden, pulling weeds with a ferocity that was more than just gardening. "You heard," she stated, not asked. She sat on the wrought iron bench we'd placed under the old maple tree. I sat back on my heels, wiping my muddy glove across my forehead. "We heard." "And," she prompted, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "And, I don't know, Harriet." I sighed, the fight going out of me. "It's what he deserves. It's what we wanted. Justice, safety. And yet, it feels like a death. A death we have to mourn all over again." "You're not mourning him," Harriet said, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. "You're mourning the last ghost of a possibility. However small, however foolish, there was a part of you that maybe, just maybe, wondered if a miracle could happen. If the boy you knew was still in there somewhere. This transfer kills that ghost. And that's a good thing, Hilda. Ghosts are exhausting to house." She was right, as she often was. We were not grieving for Damien, we were grieving for the final death of hope. The hope that had been a poison in its own right. A dangerous, lingering sentimentality that could have kept us tethered to the pain. That Sunday, we had a family dinner. It was just the four of us around the refinished oak table, which Henry had stained a warmer, lighter hue. The deep carvings were still there, but they felt like ancient history now, not fresh wounds. We were about to serve dessert when Leo, without any preamble, looked at the empty fifth chair. "Is that where our dad would sit?" he asked. The question landed in the middle of the table like a physical object. Clara stopped spooning ice cream into her mouth, her big eyes darting from Leo to Henry to me. Henry and I froze. We had navigated so many difficult questions, but this one, with its stark, spatial simplicity, was new. Henry was the one who found his voice first. He put down his fork and looked directly at Leo. "No, son," he said, his voice calm and sure. "That chair isn't for him. That chair is for anyone who needs it. It's for Aunt Harriet when she visits. It's for a friend you might want to bring home from school one day. It's an extra chair, for extra love. It's not a chair for someone who is gone." He didn't say for someone who chose to leave, or for someone who did bad things. He simply said, gone. It was the perfect word. It was a fact, devoid of the blistering emotion that usually accompanied this topic. Leo considered this for a moment, his head tilted. Then he nodded, a practical, childlike acceptance. "Okay. Can my friend Sam sit there next time he comes over?" "Of course he can," I said, my heart swelling with a love for my husband so fierce it stole my breath. In that moment, Henry had performed a quiet exorcism. He had reclaimed the space. The empty chair was no longer a monument to an absence. It was an invitation to a future. He had taken a symbol of loss and redefined it as a symbol of possibility. Later that night, after the children were asleep, I found Henry standing in the living room, looking at a framed photograph on the mantel. It was a recent picture of the four of us, taken in the garden, all of us smiling, squinting against the Sunday. We looked like what we were, a grandma, a grandpa, and their two grandkids. The shadows were still there, in the lines around our eyes, in the careful way Henry held himself, but they were part of the picture, not the whole picture. "You were amazing with Leo today," I said, coming to stand beside him. He slipped his arm around my waist. "We can't let his ghost have a chair at our table, Hilda. Not even an empty one." The transfer, the empty chair, the conversation with Leo, it all coalesced into a final, internal shift. The bureaucratic letter had provided the external closure, but Henry's words had forged the internal one. We were no longer the parents of a murderer, we were no longer the victims of the cliff. We were, Henry and Hilda, grandparents to Leo and Clara. We were gardeners, woodcarvers, and volunteers. Our story was still being written, but the darkest chapters were finally, definitively, behind us. The narrative was ours now, and we were filling it with light, with life, and with a love that had been tested in the fiercest of fires and had not broken. It was bent, it was scarred, but it was, and would always be, unbroken. The seasons turned, painting our new world in the vibrant hues of a deep New England autumn. The maple tree in our garden became a roaring bonfire of red and orange, and the air carried the crisp, smoky scent of change. It was a season of endings in nature, but for our family, it felt like the beginning of something solid, something real. The children were thriving. Leo, with his serious engineering mind, had taken to helping Henry in the garage, not with the whittling, but with projects, a birdhouse that was more fortress than home, a wagon with alarmingly ambitious steering. Clara, all boundless energy and emotion, was my shadow in the kitchen, her small hands helping me knead dough, her laughter a bright counterpoint to the quiet concentration of the men in the garage. We were falling into our roles, not as replacements, but as anchors. It was Clara who brought the invitation home, a brightly colored flyer crumpled in her fist. "Grandma, look! A harvest festival at school. There's a cake walk and pumpkin painting and everything. Can we go? Please?" I smoothed out the paper, looking at the cheerful clip art of pumpkins and scarecrows. A school event, a normal, happy, chaotic community gathering. A year ago, the very idea would have filled me with dread. The stares, the whispers behind hands, that's them, the ones whose son. The pity would have been a cage. But now, I looked at Clara's face, alight with uncomplicated excitement. I looked at Leo, who had come in from the garage, his expression cautiously hopeful. I looked at Henry, who met my gaze over their heads. In his eyes, I saw the same flicker of trepidation, but also a new, quiet resolve. "We'll go," I said, and the words felt less like a concession and more like a declaration. The night of the festival, the school gymnasium was a riot of noise and color, and the sugary smell of popcorn. Children shrieked with laughter, running between game booths. Parents clustered in groups, sipping apple cider. For a moment, Henry and I hovered at the entrance, two old ships navigating an unfamiliar, bustling harbor. Then Clara grabbed my hand and Leo grabbed Henry's, and they pulled us into the current. We were swept along to the ring toss, to the fishing pond, to the table where children were decorating cookies with violent, wonderful abandon. We were, for the first time in a public space, simply Leo and Clara's grandparents. I saw the glances, of course. A few double takes, a few murmured conversations that stopped as we approached. But the world, for the most part, had moved on. We were no longer a breaking news story. We were a footnote, a local tragedy that had been absorbed into the town's history. The pity I had feared was largely absent, replaced by the polite, casual warmth reserved for newcomers and the elderly. Then we saw Mrs. Davison, Leo's teacher. She was a warm, capable woman in her 40s who had been wonderfully kind and discreet with Leo. She approached us, a smile on her face. "Leo, Clara, having fun?" she asked, before turning to us. "Mr. and Mrs. Black, it's so good to see you here." She lowered her voice slightly, her tone genuine and devoid of morbid curiosity. "Leo has been doing so well. He's a bright, thoughtful boy. You're doing a wonderful job with them." It was a simple comment, an ordinary kindness from a teacher to grandparents. But to us, it was a benediction. It was an acknowledgement of our present, not our past. It was a recognition of the family we were now, not the family we had been. "Thank you," Henry said, his voice thick with an emotion I deeply understood. "That means a great deal." We stayed for over an hour. Henry even let himself be coaxed into the cakewalk, his large, work-roughened hand holding Clara's tiny one as they circled the numbers taped to the floor. He didn't win a cake, but he won something better. The unguarded, joyous smile on his granddaughter's face as they played together. On the drive home, the children chattered in the back seat, hyped on sugar and excitement, comparing their small, won prizes. They were already living in the memory of the festival, a happy, uncomplicated memory we had given them. That night, after the children were finally settled, exhausted and happy, Henry and I sat on the porch with cups of tea, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill. The silence between us was comfortable, filled with the echoes of the children's laughter rather than the ghosts of our past. "You know," Henry said, his voice quiet in the dark, "for the first time, I didn't feel like I was wearing a sign." "I know," I replied. We were just us. We had spent so long defined by a single catastrophic event. Our identity had been forged in betrayal and survival. But tonight, we had begun the delicate process of integration. We were not denying our history. We were simply refusing to let it be our sole definition. We were also the people who took their grandchildren to the harvest festival. We were the people who helped with the ring toss and lost the cakewalk. The story of our lives was a heavy, leather-bound book. For years, we had been stuck on one terrible, devastating chapter. We had reread it, analyzed it, let its poison seep into every other page. But tonight, with the chill of the autumn air on our faces and the memory of Clara's happy shrieks in our ears, it felt like we had finally, tentatively, turned the page. The next chapter was blank. It was full of potential, and, yes, a little bit of fear. But it was ours to write. And for the first time, we were no longer afraid of the pen. We were no longer just survivors, grappling with the wreckage of the past. We were authors, and we were ready to begin. Winter arrived, draping our cottage and garden in a hushed white blanket. The world outside our windows became a study in monochrome, the stark black branches of the maple tree etched against the pale sky. Inside, however, our home was a capsule of warmth and color, filled with the children's drawings taped to the refrigerator and the rich, earthy smell of Henry's wood. The forced stillness of the season mirrored an internal quiet that had settled over Henry and me. The frantic energy of survival had faded, replaced by a slower, more deliberate rhythm. The echoes were still there, but they were distant now, like church bells heard from far away. Henry's whittling had evolved. He had moved on from small birds and was now working on a single, more ambitious piece, a family of owls, nestled together on a branch. There was a large protective owl, its wings slightly spread, a smaller one tucked close to its side, and two wide-eyed owlets peeking out from between them. He didn't say it was us, but I knew. He would spend hours by the fire, the sharp, sweet scent of cedar filling the room, his knife scraping away everything that wasn't the family he was carefully bringing to life from the wood. One afternoon, Leo pulled a chair up beside him, watching the process with intense fascination. "How do you know what's inside the wood, Grandpa?" he asked, his small voice serious. Henry paused, holding the rough owl shape in his hand. "You don't, not exactly," he said, his gaze soft as he looked at his grandson. "You just have to trust your hands. You have to look at the grain, feel the knots, and listen. The wood tells you what it wants to be. You just help it find its way out." The lesson was about more than carving. It was about our lives. We had been a block of wood, shattered and split. We were slowly, patiently, carving out a new shape from the pieces that remained, learning to follow the new grain of our lives. My own therapy was in the seed catalogs that began arriving in January, their pages a riot of impossible color and promise during the grayest days. I would spread them out on the oak table, now scarred but strong, and lose myself in the descriptions of heirloom tomatoes and fragrant sweet peas. I was planning my garden, not just as a hobby, but as an act of faith. It was a belief in a future we would be here to see. I would involve the children, letting them pick out packets of radishes and giant sunflowers, their choices based solely on the pictures on the front. We were planning for sunshine and growth. The most profound moment of that winter, however, came from an unexpected source. Leo's school held a Heritage Day, where children were encouraged to bring in something that represented their family's history. Other children brought flags, traditional recipes, photographs of ancestors arriving at Ellis Island. Leo came to me the night before, a troubled look on his face. "Grandma," he said, "what's our heritage?" The question struck me with the force of a physical blow. What was our heritage? A beautiful lie? A murder? A fall from a cliff? How could we possibly encapsulate that for a second-grade class? I was about to suggest the oak table, a piece of furniture built with love, when Henry, who had been listening from his armchair, spoke up. "Wait here, Leo," he said. He left the room and returned a moment later, holding not the finished owl family, but a small, simple bird he had carved months ago. It was a sparrow, its form clean and elegant, captured mid-hop. "This is our heritage," Henry said, placing the small wooden sparrow in Leo's hands. "This is what our family does. We see something that's broken, or just a rough piece of wood, and we don't throw it away. We work with it. We are patient, we listen, and we find the beauty that's hiding inside. We make something new, something strong, and something good out of what we have. That's our story, Leo. That's who we are." Leo looked down at the small bird in his palms, his small fingers tracing the smooth wings. A slow smile spread across his face. It made sense to him. It was tangible. It was true. He took the sparrow to school the next day. When he came home, he was beaming. "Everyone liked it, Grandpa. Jake said his heritage is pizza, but I think ours is better." Henry and I laughed, a real, unburdened laugh that felt as nourishing as the winter sun streaming through the window. In that moment, we had done it. We had successfully translated the unspeakable trauma of our past into a simple, powerful legacy of resilience and creation for the next generation. We had taken the poison and transformed it, not by ignoring it, but by alchemizing it with love and patience. That night, I looked at the family of owls taking shape on Henry's workbench. I looked at the seed catalogs open on the table, at the small, wooden sparrow now sitting proudly on our mantel. The whittle and the seed, one represented the past, carefully shaped and understood. The other represented the future, full of hope and potential. We were no longer trapped between the two. We were the bridge. We were the carvers and the gardeners. Our hands, which had once clung to each other in terror at the bottom of a gorge, were now busy with the quiet, sacred work of building a world. A small, good, honest world for two children who deserve to know that from even the most shattered pieces, something beautiful can always be made. Spring returned, not with a timid whisper, but with a confident, verdant shout. The garden I had planned during the gray winter days erupted into life. Tiny green shoots pushed stubbornly through the dark earth, fulfilling the promise held in those colorful catalog pages. The children and I tended them daily, their small hands carefully patting soil around the stems, their wonder at the process a constant reminder of life's quiet, persistent magic. Henry's family of owls was complete. He had applied a light, honey-colored stain that deepened the wood's grain, making the figures seem to glow with a soft, internal light. He didn't put them on a high shelf or in a glass case. He placed them in the center of our refinished oak table, where they became a permanent, silent part of our daily rhythm. They watched over breakfast, cereal, and homework, over board games and whispered secrets. They were our totem, a testament to what we had remade. The anniversary of the fall came and went. This year, it did not feel like a jagged scar. It felt more like a seam, a place where two different fabrics of our lives had been joined, painfully and imperfectly, but joined nonetheless. The memory was there, but it had lost its power to cripple. It was now a part of our history, not the dictator of our present. On a warm Saturday in May, we decided to have a picnic. Not in some grand, scenic overlook, but in our own backyard, under the dappled shade of the maple tree, now dressed in its fresh, green leaves. Henry fired up the small grill for hamburgers. I made a potato salad, the same recipe I'd used for decades at family gatherings, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't a performance for a critical audience. It was nourishment for the people I loved the most. As we laid the checkered blanket on the grass, Leo ran to help Henry, his movements echoing his grandfather's deliberate care. Clara danced around me, setting out plates with a solemn importance that made me smile. The sun was warm on my skin, the air sweet with the scent of lilac and grilled meat. The sounds were the sounds of any happy family on a weekend, sizzling from the grill, childish laughter, the clink of cutlery. We sat on the blanket, the four of us, and began to eat. The owls watched from the table inside the open kitchen door. There was no fifth chair, real or imagined. There was no empty space at our circle. We were complete. Henry raised his glass of lemonade. His eyes, which had held so much guilt and terror, were clear and calm. They met mine, then Leo's, then Clara's. "To us," he said, his voice simple and strong. "To our family." We clinked our glasses together, the sound a tiny, perfect chime in the spring air. "To us." In that moment, surrounded by the life we had chosen to build, I understood the full measure of our journey. The fall from the cliff had not been the end of our story. Henry's whisper of "play dead" had not been a surrender. It had been the first, desperate strategy in a war for our very souls. We had played dead to survive. We had then chosen to live, not just breathe. We had carved a new family from the wreckage of the old. We had planted a garden in poisoned soil and tended it until it bloomed. We had taken the legacy of a murderer and transformed it into a legacy of a craftsman and a gardener. The perfect, glossy family we had once presented to the world was a fragile piece of china, and it had shattered. What we had built in its place was not china. It was like Henry's oak table, solid, heavy, scarred, and unbreakable. It could bear weight. It could withstand storms. It was built to last. We are Hilda and Henry. We are grandparents. We are survivors. Our story is one of betrayal, yes, but it is, more importantly, a story of a love that refused to be annihilated. It is a story that proves that even from the deepest darkness, you can find your way back to the light, and that sometimes the most beautiful families are not the perfect ones, but the unbroken ones. We finished our picnic as the sun began to dip below the fence, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The children, tired and happy, leaned against us as we packed up. There were no ghosts at our picnic. There were no echoes in the twilight. There was only the peaceful, profound silence of a battle won, a life reclaimed, and a family, at long last, whole. The table was unbroken. And so were we. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.